2 semesters ago, right? Anyway, it's really great to be here and to be able to talk with you a little bit about working with clients with trauma histories. I do want to say before I start that obviously we will be talking about trauma and traumatic topics. And so if you need to take care of yourself in any way, for example, shutting off your camera at any point, that is totally understood and makes sense. Obviously, I'd love to see your faces if you feel comfortable doing so. So I wanted to start with some introductions. I'd love to hear your name, of course, your pronouns if you'd like to share them. And then if you've worked with clients with trauma histories in the past, and if you have ever had any kind of training on trauma-informed services. So I'll start. My name is Abigail. My pronouns are she, her. I formerly worked at the sanctuary. I was a staff attorney there for 5 years. I originally came on a public interest fellowship, and I was focusing on the intersection of legal services and mental health care, specifically how to incorporate trauma-informed principles into our work and how to collaborate with mental health care professionals. And I just transitioned from EBSC. I'm at East Bay Community Law Center now in their immigration unit. So if you ever do that clinic in the future, hopefully I'll see you there too. So I'm not sure what the best way for us to do this would be. Does anyone want to volunteer? And again, the 2 questions besides your general introduction would be if you've worked with clients with trauma histories and if you've had any kind of training in trauma-informed work.
I can go ahead. Hi, my name is Taya, and I have worked in immigration before. I worked for constituent services for my senator and my representative. So a lot of those victims have been through various sorts of trauma, but at that job, I did not get any formal training. And then on campus during undergrad, I also worked with survivors of abuse, and I got some trauma-informed training specifically for sexual abuse trauma victims.
Do we want to do the dreaded popcorning to pick the next person? Okay.
Okay, I can popcorn to meat.
Oh, sorry, I was just trying to find my unmute button. So my name's Meet. I am the recruiting coordinator at CARC. As for having worked with, clients that have gone through trauma, I haven't, other than through CARC, right? And I also haven't been formally trained either, because I joined in the spring semester, at which point we weren't doing the training. So I haven't been fully trained, so I'm really looking forward to this. And yeah, I think everybody else knows about me, but basically I'm a 3L with an interest in tech law, and I do want to put my sort of pro bono practice centered around immigration and essentially immigration and the homeless problem law. Thank you.
Do you want to popcorn to someone?
Oh yeah, that's what we're doing. I'll popcorn to Jonah.
Hi all.
Jonah, sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Confusing. But yeah, my name is Yona. I'm a 1L. Pronouns are she, her. Prior to this, I worked in homeless services, and so I worked directly with people experiencing homelessness. And I did get some, but I think, yeah, I still don't. Jordan.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jordan. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
And I don't really have experience doing this type of work, so I'm excited for the training and learning more about how to use trauma-informed practices. And I'll popcorn to Mitch.
Hi, my name is Mitch Aronoff. I'm 1L, he, him pronouns. I've never had like formal training for like counseling and like working with people who have experienced trauma, but I used to counsel sex ed to homeless youth, so I do have some experience. But I'm excited to learn more and really get involved. I also was a little bit late, so I'm not entirely sure who hasn't gone yet. So I don't know. Abigail,
I'll jump in. I'll jump in. Mitchell, thanks for sharing. I'm Becca, pronouns
Thanks.
she, her. I've worked with survivors of sexual violence in the workplace and in education environments for several years, and then I've done CARC work and asylum work with Oasis as well. And I've been lucky to receive trauma training in my past job every year, and then last year with CARC too. And I'm gonna popcorn to Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin, a 1L, like many of us. I use he, him pronouns. Yeah, I used to lead an international aid organization that worked with clients, all of whom had experienced some pretty extreme traumas. And so I've actually partnered with the San Francisco Trauma Recovery Center to both receive trainings, and I've also given some of these trainings, and I just find there's always so much more to learn to sort of just like deepen my understanding and connect more dots. And so really happy to be here.
Let's popcorn to Mia.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mia. Sorry, I'm a few minutes late. My pronouns are she, her. I worked for many years in a community health center with recently arrived immigrant children and families, mostly unaccompanied minors. And it was interesting because we said we provided trauma-informed services, and we had an on-site team of therapists and medical providers, but I don't remember ever receiving specific direct training, which is, we can talk about. And then our attorneys did training in trauma-informed lawyering. And so it was sort of infused into our work, but I'm really excited to have more direct training. And I'm not sure who remains as well, but.
Have we heard from Arthur? There we go.
Yes, I can go ahead. Hi, everybody. My name is Arthur. I'm an LLM student. I'm from France, and I just joined CARC this semester. So far, I don't really have experience with trauma people. I've just been involved in a financial literacy program where we also received a bit of background about how to speak with people who experience trauma and we're in a difficult situation. But I think that was not comparable to the training we're about to get today. So I very much look forward to the session today, and I will let now maybe Jamie speak.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I had my video off. I was traveling from a personal appointment, but my name is Jamie. I'm a 2L. I was a member of CARC last year, and I'm a co-coordinator of CARC this year. I use she, her pronouns. Prior to law school, I worked with families who, among other things, experienced trauma related to really difficult medical situations and medical diagnoses for their children. So quite different from immigration and asylum work, but nonetheless, clients experiencing trauma. I did this training last year and found it to be incredibly helpful, and I look forward to a refresher this year. And I will popcorn to, let's see here. Arohi? I don't think you've gone yet.
Hey, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Arun Kashyap. I'm from India. I'm a LLM student here. I have worked with people who have experienced a certain amount of trauma, and I do that both in the cohort of our firm, where I dealt with some victims of domestic violence, especially women who were trying to get out of marriages and relationships that were quite abusive. And then I was part of CARC last semester, so I worked with a client then as well. Yeah, I'm looking forward to working this semester as well, and I think the same is also. Thank you. Oh, and I'll pass it on to, I don't know who's not spoken before, so if anybody could just come up.
Margaret, why don't you go?
Yeah, I don't know who else hasn't gone, but I'm one of the co-leaders of CARC. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a 3L. I have worked with clients through CARC in both my 1L and 2L years, and I also did the Blast Tijuana trip when I was a 1L, and I received trauma-informed lawyering trainings for both CARC and the Blast trip in my 1L and I think 2L years, although my pandemic law school year is mostly a haze, so I can't really remember if I actually went to a training last year. But I have received some trainings and I'm looking forward to working with you all this year through CARC again. And I don't know if there's anyone who has not introduced themselves. If you haven't introduced yourself, just speak up, but I think we have everyone.
Okay, well, it's really great to be here with all of you. Becca told me in advance that we have a wealth of knowledge and experience among the group, and it seems like we really do. So yeah, let's dive in. And if you have questions throughout, why don't you throw them in the chat, and I will try to remember to check it every so often. And if not, we'll have questions at the end. So what we'll be going over today. So first, why a trauma-informed approach. Then we'll talk a little bit about what trauma is and how it affects people. And we'll talk about best practices for serving clients who have histories of trauma. And then we'll talk specifically a little bit about trauma and memory, how trauma affects memory, and how we can work to elicit traumatic narratives from our clients, given how trauma affects memory. And then at the end, we'll talk about vicarious trauma and caring for self while caring for others, which is just as important as every other piece of this agenda here. So starting on why is it so important to have a trauma-informed approach? So from a legal perspective, what are our goals within an asylum case? We need to have the client be able to remember enough to write a declaration explaining what happened to them. We need to have the client feel comfortable and well enough in order to testify effectively at their asylum interview or in a court hearing. So for that perspective, trauma can affect a person's capacity to trust other people. And as legal practitioners, we need our clients to trust us to be able to get to these legal outcomes. We also need our clients to be able to remember what happened to them in order to be able to share them. So that's kind of a legal perspective for why a trauma-informed approach is so important, especially within asylum law and other immigration law as well. And then from a human perspective, so I remember when I was at 2L, I had an internship doing very similar work. And I was really struck by the fact that even though these legal services were necessary, leading to complete positive change within our clients' lives, my clients were telling me that actually as they're working with their attorneys, their symptoms of PTSD or depression were actually getting worse. And this was not even just these were clients who hadn't gotten to the stage of an asylum interview, of talking with the government. It was just the experience of working with their attorneys that was actually exacerbating their mental health symptoms. So I personally think that as attorneys working in this field, we have a responsibility to minimize harm and to minimize re-traumatization, which is a concept we'll talk more about later on in the presentation. And then I think beyond that, we can have an aspiration to help facilitate healing as part of this process, because even though the process really has a danger of being re-traumatizing, of being a very difficult one for our clients in terms of their mental health, there's also a lot of potential for healing. There is a potential for you to be someone who the clients can trust, who they can share with. Not all survivors of trauma are going to be helped by speaking about their trauma, but many can be helped. It can be catharsis, can be healing. So I think that's kind of from a human perspective why this is so important to learn about trauma-informed principles in the services we're providing. So starting off with kind of a general definition of trauma. So it's a psychological and emotional response to an event that's deeply distressing, disturbing, or threatening. Really kind of the hallmark of trauma is that it's something that is so horrible that it overwhelms the system. And because it overwhelms the system, because the system is not able to fully experience this as you would any other normal experience in life, the trauma actually stays with you and it has lasting effects. I think we'll talk more about it later, but trauma is a very physiological phenomenon. And because of that, the results of trauma are very much felt in the body, even though it's also an emotional, psychological response. So during the actual trauma, how does a person respond? So it's very much about survival. The response may be very automatic. You're not like, doing a lot of analysis, thinking with your frontal cortex. It's very much kind of an automatic survival. How do I get through this? It's very common to have dissociation response during trauma, something that's so horrible that you just kind of check out. So for example, I have a client who was sexually assaulted. She says it was like she was actually at the top of the room looking down at what was happening. So that's the way that her brain was protecting her, that it took her actually out of what was happening. And it was as though she was a bystander. Another response to trauma may be the narrowing of focus. So you stop paying attention to anything outside, because again, this is all about survival. And there's a lack of reflection, an intense but limited attention, very much focused on exactly what you need to be focusing on just to get through it. So what are the lasting effects of trauma? Like I said, the response to trauma is about survival. You go into the fight or flight response. I think we're probably all familiar with that, a way of survival. I think two other components that are not as well known as fight or flight are freeze or fawn. So freeze would be you stop, you're not able to do anything. And that can be a survival kind of mechanism, because the person may leave you alone if you freeze. That's how it evolutionarily works. And then fawn would be kind of submission, doing what the person harming you wants to do. This is a response that comes up a lot in abusive relationships. This is how you survive, by kind of by submitting, by doing what's being asked of you. So also during the trauma, as I said, the parts of the brain responsible for higher level thinking, the frontal cortex, kind of turns off. And what they call the reptilian brain, kind of the very vital functions, takes over. And some of the lasting effects of trauma is that kind of type of activity can continue. So you can still have problems with that kind of reptilian brain, which was useful in getting you to survive the actual trauma, but it continues that way after, even though when you're not in danger anymore. And so that's the problem, that the body and the brain get stuck in this stress response. And the stress response in the moment is adaptive. It's what gets you through it, but it's no longer adaptive once you're actually out of the physical danger. And so one way of describing it is that there's an alarm constantly going off. So the alarm is there to save you from the danger, but when it keeps going off, it has a lot of negative effects. So here are some of the lasting effects. This kind of follows the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In order to get diagnosed with it, you have to have symptoms from each of these 4 clusters, as they call it. Just because you don't have a formal diagnosis of PTSD does not mean that you're not suffering from the effects of trauma, but I just wanted to go through these 4 clusters. So the first is the intrusion symptoms. So the kind of classic intrusion symptoms, for example, of a war vet would be flashbacks, where you get triggered by something, all of a sudden you think you're back in the trauma. That's not necessarily something that all people who have PTSD go through. It can be more some distressing memories that you don't want to be thinking about, but you can't help it. Nightmares, physical reactivity to being reminded of the trauma. So let's say you get triggered by something and you're not necessarily going to flash back and think that you're reliving the trauma again, but your body might start reliving the trauma again. So let's say you get triggered, your heart might start beating faster. You might start breathing faster. You might get sweaty. It's like your body is reacting to this reminder of the danger, even if you know that you're not there. So avoidance is people who have suffered trauma and are suffering from PTSD tend to avoid thinking about the trauma, and they can really alter their lives in an effect not to think about it. So maybe avoiding certain activities, certain people that remind you of the trauma. It kind of goes hand in hand with these intrusion symptoms, right? Because thinking of the trauma is so distressing that you make a lot of efforts to avoid it. This is something that's going to come up with our clients a lot. You may have clients that have not applied for asylum despite being in the US for many years, and that can be because they didn't want to be thinking about what happened to them because of how distressing it can be to think about it. So then the third cluster is negative alterations in mood and cognition. So this can be similar to depression or anxiety symptoms. Negative beliefs about yourself. Blaming yourself is very common, or blaming others for causing the trauma. Decreased interest in various activities that used to bring you pleasure or joy. A sense of isolation, feeling disconnected from other people. I was talking to a client the other day who said ever since the trauma happened, he doesn't have friends. He just has acquaintances. He doesn't feel able to trust people enough to have connection. And another negative alteration in cognition is an inability to remember. And we'll talk more about the effects of trauma on memory later. And then the last one is arousal and reactivity. So in the psychological context, this would mean, so hypervigilance. This is again going back to the alarm going off. You think you're in danger all the time, having a heightened startle reaction. Again, your body is really trying to help be on the lookout for danger so that it can protect you like it wanted to during the trauma. This can lead to difficulty sleeping or concentrating, irritability or impulsivity. So those are the 4 clusters. Another large lasting effect of trauma is dissociation. So like I said, this is a psychological defense mechanism for when something is too overwhelming or too distressing. So you check out. You can become very even disconnected from your body. Dissociation can alter how you're perceiving time, memory, and lead to a fragmented sense of identity. And as I mentioned before, trauma really lives in the body. And I think in the past, the treatment for trauma really focused on being able to say out loud a narrative of the trauma. But actually the more recent research is that the most important treatment of trauma has to do with the body. So types of somatic treatment that address the fact that even though trauma is a psychological, emotional phenomenon, it's really living in the body. And if you're interested in this, I definitely recommend this book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is a really important book about how trauma works. And as you can tell by the title, really focusing on how it lives in the body. Okay, yes, amazing book. Sorry. 1 second. Okay, to go back, so re-traumatization. This is really important for you to know. So if there's a reminder of past trauma, you can re-experience the traumatic event, and it can be just as harmful as the original trauma. So this can be triggered by a situation, attitude or expression, certain environments. And what could be added in this bullet point is having to talk about your trauma to your lawyer and or the government. And so we really want to be mindful of this because there's the potential of talking about trauma causing all the same symptoms that the original trauma would have caused. So for example, someone who's kind of compartmentalized it away, if they then are reminded and talk about the trauma, they could start experiencing all the symptoms of PTSD, just as if they had actually gone through the original trauma. So how might a client present who has a history of trauma that's affecting them? So they might be detached and unemotional. So even talking about the trauma, they might seem to be not reacting in ways you might expect. There's a great fear that people will not be believed. And then oftentimes a lot of shame around the trauma, especially with interpersonal trauma and sexual trauma. So they might appear not to have trauma symptoms at all, or are what they call over-compliant. So they may be trying to protect you. They don't want you to feel overwhelmed by hearing what happened to them. And this may lead to underreporting, so not sharing all the trauma they have, which obviously is we need to know everything. Or kind of on the opposite side, they might be easily flooded with emotion, and it might be really difficult to understand what they're saying. So here are some signs of trauma response during the appointment. So non-responsiveness, if they're kind of just not stop answering your questions. Jumpiness, fidgeting, sweating, incongruence of affect. So that's what I was saying before, where they might be talking about something really horrible, but kind of have a flat affect. And to someone who's not familiar with trauma, that might seem like they're not telling the truth because they're not reacting how you would expect them to react, given the topic of what they're talking about, but it's actually a symptom of trauma. I've also had clients who show up and are talking about really horrible things, but smiling. Again, incongruence of affect. You might see them staring off into space. That can be a sign of dissociation, tearfulness, blunted affect. So as I mentioned, kind of flat, difficulty concentrating on what you're asking, and then also coming late to appointments or missing appointments may be signs of trauma, either in terms of finding it difficult to function at all, or this kind of avoidance piece. So what can we do, given all that, to build trust and a sense of safety? So transparency, empathy, validation. So transparency, I think I'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. But an important thing is to validate what the client is saying, but not to assume what they're saying. Don't assume that you know what part of the client's narrative is most difficult for them, because what it might seem like to you might be totally different than what they think. One way you can build trust is to make small promises and keep them. So I'm going to call you on this date, and then you go ahead and follow up and do what you promised. And that can kind of start to build a sense of trust to build on. You want to give the client control and choice whenever possible. So for example, let them decide where to sit. Give them choice in when you meet. The thing with trauma is that the person lost agency during the trauma. And so however you can give them back that agency is going to help create a sense of safety. Some clients will kind of not want to choose. They'll be like, you decide, and that's fine too. So one important thing is normalization. So let them know that, what they're feeling is very normal. A lot of people, feel really badly after this type of meeting. This is really difficult for a lot of people. In general, this legal situation can be very, very stressful for people. So all that can help reduce stigma. I've heard of clients who went to an appointment, they went home, they felt bad for like a week and they thought that they were going crazy. But actually that's a really common response to talking about your trauma. Setting expectations. So laying out what's going to happen, both kind of within the meeting for that day, and then also in general for the process. And then just keeping in mind how huge it can be as part of the client's experience, shame and being afraid that you won't be believed. And just really kind of taking that responsibility very seriously. So before and at the start of the appointment, you can start to build trust, not diving right into the trauma, but asking about your present life, building trust through language. Obviously, the ideal is that you can speak the client's language, but if you don't and you're using an interpreter, being mindful of that. And if you can speak a few words of the language, going out of your way to do that, just to kind of build the trust and connection with the client. So as I said, you want to set the expectations for what's going to happen, explaining what the appointment will be like, and explaining why we need to ask these questions, because these are very personal questions. They might seem very strange. So I always try to explain why I'm asking the questions and then make it clear that the client can always ask why are you asking these questions? And they can also always decline to answer the questions, but making it clear that the reason we're asking these questions always has to do with helping you with your case. Like I said, it can help to share that this is usually a very emotionally difficult experience for many clients, so their experience is to be expected. Always offering the option for breaks or changing the topic or ending the session. That always should be an option of the client so that they don't feel stuck the way they may have felt stuck before during their traumatic experiences. One thing with breaks is that a lot of clients will not take you up on that offer, so it's good to keep offering the breaks throughout the session. One thing that I would do back in the non-pandemic days is have a bunch of options for the clients to do with their hands. So like stress balls or little toys, paper and pencils for drawing. So it's harder to do that now, but you can share at the beginning of your session that some clients do find that helpful to have on hand. And that way they can find something of their own. So this is these are some suggestions from the Wright Institute, which is they're an educational institution. They teach people to be psychologists, and they've worked with us to train our staff and volunteers. So they focus on these levels of intensity. So these levels of trauma. So there are 3. One would be kind of minimal emotional stimulation, the flat affect, so not a lot of emotion. And oftentimes it won't match the content of the trauma. So this is kind of still very traumatized, but one emotional reaction to it. Level 2 is that there is connection with their emotion, but not overwhelmed or out of control. So they're talking about the trauma in a way that matches what they're saying emotionally, but it doesn't seem that they're re-experiencing the trauma. And then level 3 would be just kind of overwhelmed by talking about the trauma. It's like you're reliving the trauma in the present, crying, gasping for breath, other kind of signs that someone actually feels that they're reliving the trauma. And so people can experience all these different kinds of levels. Kind of one of the hallmarks of trauma is that in general, people tend to stay at level 2, but with trauma, it can be really easy to dip into either the level 1, the kind of flat lack of emotion, or level 3, reliving. And it can be kind of hard to stay in that middle zone, which is the healthy zone. So different clients might be in different levels, even within the same appointment. So if someone is in that level 1, so flat, not connecting emotionally, what you can do is kind of increase that intensity by anchoring in the trauma. So asking questions about how you were feeling, asking for specific details of what happened, asking for kind of sensory, what happened visually, what did you hear, what did you smell, types of memories, asking about their fears, or asking what happened in their bodies, how did it feel like. On the other hand, if you have someone that is at this level 3, so really high intensity, reliving the trauma, you can try to decrease that intensity by anchoring in the present. So asking concrete questions that are not related to trauma. So what age were you? Did you like living in your town? How many people were present? Using a calming voice tone. Or sometimes you want to just stop the client from talking and anchoring in the present. You know, where are we? Right now we're in Berkeley. It's in 2021. Anchoring to where we actually are now. You can repeat and rephrase what the client is saying. If the client is really overwhelmed, trying to check out, have them open their eyes, describe what the current setting is. So I would actually say, be careful about asking a client to open their eyes, because they should be able to have the agency to keep their eyes closed if they want. But one way is asking them to kind of describe what's going on. So I find it helpful to maybe describe all 4 walls, because that's going to connect you into the present. Maybe ask them to identify one thing on each of the 4 walls. You can also use relaxation or breathing exercises. You can ask clients about activities that are not related to the trauma. You know, what were you doing before this appointment? What do you have plans for the rest of the day? So I wanted to talk specifically about some issues that come up with the type of questionings that we have to ask to prepare an asylum case. So like we talked about before, some of the common negative thoughts in people that have PTSD are, what happened to me was my fault, so self-blame, or no one will believe me or support me if I tell them what happened. Meanwhile, some common lines of questioning that we have to ask to prepare an asylum declaration: were you harmed because of who you are? Why didn't you leave an abusive relationship? What proof do you have that you were harmed? And why aren't the details of the story matching up? So these are all very important questions for us to answer. We can't just say, oh, I'm not going to address that, because I don't want the client to feel like they're not believed. So how can we pursue those lines of questioning in a way that's not playing into these negative thoughts of self-blame or not being believed? So these are some possible approaches. I think transparency can be really important here. So it can be easy to just kind of ask the questions that you need, but it's important to kind of step back and explain to the client why you're asking these questions. So you can explain that for asylum, it's very important to know the reasons why they harmed you, the motives, what drove them. You can also kind of externalize the potential disbelief. And what I mean by that is placing it on the government. So the asylum officer will want to know this. How would you explain it to them? Or the reason why I'm asking is so we can be prepared for any questions the asylum officer might ask you. It's not because I don't believe you. You can also frame the questions to be more explicit that you're blaming the persecutor. So I think one really helpful way of framing it is, why did he think he could do that? Because it's clear we don't think that he could do that, but why did he think that? And then I think trying your best to communicate your support and normalizing this. So it could be, why did you leave your children when you came here? Could come across as blaming. But if you kind of frame it as, I know that there are many reasons that people have to leave their children to come to the US. In your situation, why did you have to do that? And then another approach you can take is just focusing on what the persecutor said, instead of asking about why do you think that? So if we ask what the persecutor said and they used a racial slur, we have our proof of why the persecutor was acting, just from what they said on their own. Okay, so some ways to support clients in distress during the appointment. Again, validation, and not assuming, but I can see this is hard for you, or I can understand why this might be difficult. Normalization, explaining that many people experience things like this. I've had other clients tell me similar things. So many people cry in here. You can get distance from the difficult topics. So again, re-suggest those breaks, because it can be very difficult for a client to affirmatively ask for a break, even though you gave them permission at the beginning of the session. You can also redirect questioning to a less charged topic, or you can ask the client if they want to change the topic, or even if they want to end the appointment. And then during certain topics, it can be helpful to ask yes/no questions. We obviously don't want to rely on yes/no questions, especially it can be hard to elicit a narrative that way. But for example, we'll have clients who are having a lot of difficulty coming out and saying something. And so it can be easier if you just ask them, were you raped? And that can be easier for them to answer affirmatively than to have to come out with it on their own. Some other ideas, I mentioned grounding exercises. So the naming something on each of the four walls would be an example of that. There are various breathing exercises. Kind of the most straightforward is just slowing down and taking deep breaths, especially because if the client is starting to relive the trauma, they may be breathing faster because that's the body's reaction to danger. Also, there are breathing exercises where your exhale is longer than your inhale, and that works to kind of activate the parasympathetic nervous system, so calming you down as opposed to being ready for the fight or flight. You can have them name things in the room that they can see, feel, hear, or smell, focusing on the five senses. And then also grounding can be really literal. So put your feet into the ground, feel where your body is making contact with the ground or with the chair. A glass of water can help. I think sometimes it helps the client because it's both something physical to ground them, and it's also a way to get a break. For in-person appointments, as I mentioned, you can offer objects. I think things to kind of fidget with are helpful. Things that kind of provide something tactically interesting. For example, a stone. It's cool, it's heavy. It can be something to feel grounded in the present. And then scent as well. I used to have some lavender hand cream on my desk before COVID. Another thing you can do is remind the clients of their strengths. So these are all really scary things. We're talking about ways that they were victimized, not that you necessarily want to use that language, but they survived. They got through it. They survived. They got themselves to the United States. They got themselves here. They're doing something really hard and sharing their story, and they're helping themselves. And it may be that they're also helping their families, and they're taking charge of their future. Sometimes, I would say often, you want to consider a referral to a therapist, and you can speak to your supervisor about the best way to do that. Therapy is not the only form of healing. Some people might not want to go to a therapist. Some people might have other forms of healing that work better for them. But I think a lot of times therapy can be really helpful. And sometimes the barrier can be in the potential stigma. So one thing I like to do is I really focus on, this is an experience you're going through and it's stressful for a lot of people. And a lot of people find that it can be helpful to get some support. I've heard some people say that it can be less stigmatizing to use the word counselor instead of therapist. It's also, some people just haven't heard of therapy. And in that case, I explain what it is and that it's the therapist's job is to help make you feel better. If they have heard of therapy and seem apprehensive about it, I sometimes will explain that therapy in this country doesn't mean you're crazy. Lots of people go to therapy. It's a way to get support and a way to feel better. I think it's also important to talk about that the therapist has a different job than us. Their job is to help make you feel better. Our job is to help you tell your story. And with a therapist, if they're a good therapist, you don't necessarily need to talk about anything you don't want to. So I wanted to specifically talk about the step of reviewing the declaration. So after you've had your meetings with the client, asked them questions, written it all down, you're going to want to review it. This is a really tricky point because what you want is for the client to be paying attention and telling you anything that's wrong so that we don't in the future come up with, oh, there's this discrepancy where you said this in the declaration, you're saying this at the interview. But the thing is, this is a really, really difficult experience for a client to have to hear everything terrible that happened to you in kind of this really intense way. So a lot of the clients are like, I'm just going to check out. I will just say yes, because that's what the attorney wants. But I'm going to be somewhere else, not paying attention because this is too terrible. So I think you really want to address that from the outset because it's really important that they don't do that to whatever extent you can possible. So explaining how important it is to listen carefully and why we want them to listen carefully, because we want to avoid inconsistencies that could make the officer think that you're not telling the truth. I also sometimes try to put the blame on myself. I really need you to listen to make sure that I didn't make any mistakes. You can also definitely normalize, explain that you understand that this can be a really difficult process. A lot of clients need breaks. It can be really tempting not to listen, but it's really important that if it's too difficult, we take a break instead of checking out. And really emphasizing that this is the client story and it's your job to get it right. And that's why we're doing this. Then ending the appointment. So I like to think about it in terms of zipping up. So you've kind of laid out all the trauma, really kind of vulnerable, emotional, and then you want to zip the client up before you send them back into the world. So you can focus on easier or less emotionally challenging lines of questioning. I often ask if they have any plans for what to do after the appointment. That kind of both lowers the emotional intensity and also brings them back into the present. Like I said before, you want to normalize that it can be normal to feel badly in the days after the appointment. I like to ask if there's something in general that makes them feel better, because I don't want to presume. For some clients, it can be speaking with family or friends, taking a walk, spending time in nature otherwise, being with their children, praying, listening to music, journaling. If they do have a therapist, because some clients will already have a therapist, has the therapist talk with them about ideas that can help, because it can be helpful to get a reminder of what are some things that will help you. And then after you've ended, whenever possible, avoid asking clients questions about trauma outside of the appointments, because it can just be very disruptive emotionally. And when it is absolutely necessary, acknowledge that it can be difficult emotionally. All right, 1 second. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about how trauma affects memory. So traumatic memory is different than regular memory. And I think there are kind of two components here, that there's a way that kind of people or specifically government officers think that memory works. And that's not necessarily the case for anyone. And then there are specific ways that trauma affects memory as well. So traumatic memories are fragmented, and they can be very much tied to emotion and tied to senses, not so much focused on detail, because remember, again, you're the kind of parts of your brain focused on higher reasoning were not in too much in play at the time of the trauma because you were focused on survival. If there's repetitive chronic trauma, which is the case for a lot of our clients, especially clients who have been in domestic violence situations, the memory might feel very blocked off. There's a lot of numbing, there's a lot of avoidance. So trauma can affect memory in various ways. So specifically, it can be hard to remember all or parts of the trauma, or it can affect memory globally. So you just have problems with memory in general. And then there can be dissociative processes. So a lack of integration of the traumatic memories. They don't feel like they're part of your overall narrative of your life. They can feel really very fragmented off. Or they're stored as sensory perceptions, rumination, behavioral reenactments. And once again, we come back to trauma being stored in the body. So traumatic memory can be stored kind of like headaches or stomach aches. Here are some common memory myths that are really myths for anyone. So having a memory is a videotape. You go back and you remember exactly what happened minute by minute. That doesn't happen. The idea that we would kind of remember a stressful event is seared into your memory, but actually under threat and stress, memory can decrease. There's this myth that if you're consistent, that if you're being truthful, then you're going to be consistent. But actually, it's normal to have inconsistency in detail in memory, and especially with traumatic memory. And then another myth is that true memory is consistent over time, but it's actually an active process, and it varies. This is a problem for this idea behind asylum that you're going to remember everything perfectly. So here are some ideas for eliciting traumatic memories given those limitations. So building rapport, building trust like we talked about, giving it time, and building security in the ways that you can. So giving the client permission to say, you know, I know that sometimes you forget things and you might remember them later, and that's totally fine to correct something that you need to. One technique could be cathartic storytelling. So this would be like in an early meeting where you just let the client, you ask the client an open-ended question and they talk about it. This might be the case. There's some clients that have not told their story, and once given the opportunity to, it just kind of all spills out. So you can use it to develop an empathetic relationship, to show that you care, that you want to know and understand, and that can serve as kind of an overview of information, a starting point for narrowing in more on the elements that you need. There is a technique called chaining, where you're helping the client make connections to remember the order of events. So basically asking what happened next, what happened next. Or there's the affective recall technique, where you can focus on related emotion to kind of trigger what actually happened, or focusing on the five senses as a way to kind of trigger this memory back. With these, there's a higher potential for triggering PTSD symptoms. So, you know, going back to those levels of intensity, if someone is already feeling a lot of emotion and feeling overwhelmed, then you don't want to start asking about more questions about how they were feeling or what the physical sensations were. Another technique you can use is a timeline. You can create the timeline based on what they're saying and then check with the client about what they think and kind of use that to put together what happened. Or you can have the clients having a lot of trouble remembering things, you can have them do homework. And anything they remember, they can write down in a little notebook or something like that. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about vicarious trauma, which, as I mentioned, is just as important as all the other topics we've talked about. Vicarious trauma is the trauma response in the service provider to hearing about someone else's trauma, to hearing about their client's trauma. And it can manifest as kind of nonstop worrying about clients. You can't stop thinking about them. It can manifest as depression, anxiety. It can seem related to clients, so you're thinking about them all the time, or you can just start noticing changes in mood that have started since you've been doing this work that might necessarily feel related to the client stories. And I think this is also, your reaction to trauma is also going to depend on your own trauma history, your own kind of baseline mental health. This is another really great book that I recommend, Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. It's an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. Really, really interesting book. Talks about all the ways that trauma can affect providers. And one interesting thing is that it's very broad. So not only lawyers, social workers, but I think one of you mentioned kind of medical trauma. So say working in the ER, something like that, maybe medical professionals working during COVID, or even like scientists working with endangered species. So I thought that was really interesting, all the different types of trauma that can have this effect. And it talks about how important it is to recognize these effects on yourself and to work on addressing them, because it's a part of this work. And I think I remember in law school, they seemed like separate things. Taking care of clients with trauma history. And then it almost felt like a little extracurricular, taking care of yourself, vicarious trauma. And they're actually very connected, because anytime you're working with clients with trauma, it's going to have an effect on yourself. And one thing I really want to emphasize is that self-care, and I'm thinking about self-care more broadly. I know that it can sometimes kind of be like, oh, bubble baths, but kind of taking care of yourself more broadly in this work is a necessity. And it can be really tempting to think like, oh, yeah, I'm having trouble. Like, I'm having these symptoms. It's difficult for me. It's maybe reminding me of something that happened to me, but all of that is nothing compared to what my client is experiencing. So why should I be focusing on myself? It's really tempting to do that, but that's really actually not helpful to you or the client. Because taking care of yourself is not only something you deserve as a human, it's a way that makes you able to continue doing the work and continue doing the work with your full capacity, being able, the whole, like if your glass is, I forget what the metaphor is, but basically your glass needs to be full enough to help others. And I think that maybe things have changed since I was in law school, but I did not learn that this was a necessity in law school, and other professions like social work do. Like, this is just a part of their curriculum. Of course, you need to focus on yourself and how the work is affecting you in order to be an effective practitioner. So here are a few different kind of frameworks for self-care. So one is self-care as specific acts. And I think that's kind of like the most common idea of it, but it doesn't have to involve a lot of money. Something that makes you feel good: music, walking, guided meditation, journaling, wearing your most comfortable clothing or your most fashionable clothing, depending on what makes you feel good, making art, reading a book from the library, therapy. Therapy is really important. I'm a big proponent of therapy, and I think especially if you're doing this kind of work, it can be hugely helpful. Another way to think about self-care is thinking through those 5 senses. And we've talked about that with the clients too, right? So you can maybe think through the senses to choose self-care that will be helpful to you in that moment. Like, maybe like essential oils, maybe a blanket, maybe some hand cream, kind of thinking through those senses to think, kind of do an inventory. What might help me feel more supported, better in this moment? I think I also like to think about it maybe not as self-care, but self-compassion, or self-compassion in addition to self-care. That can be, I know naturally that is very hard for me. That's something I've really had to work on. And I think that can be the case for a lot of other people in this work, to work on being compassionate to yourself, to treating yourself as you would a friend, without judgment. Because I think a lot of us are a lot harder on ourselves than we would ever be to a friend or anyone else. And I think that being hard on yourself can make it really difficult to continue this work. I think self-care, drawing boundaries is also really important for self-care. It's important if you can, even if it's just a little bit. I know it can be different depending on our individual life circumstances, but to the extent you can, getting some time away from helping others, time away from the news, vacation. Vacation is really important. It can be tempting to not take vacation, but again, having that time to reset is really critical for being actually able to do the work in the long term at your highest capacity. And then this is from one of my clinical professors in law school. She called it things of beauty. So taking the time to identify things that are beautiful, that remind you of the good in the world, and really taking the time to savor those things. It can be really, really tempting to just focus on all the bad because there's a lot of bad. But again, taking care of yourself, filling your cup. I think it's also really important to savor the wins. For example, I used to do a lot of green card applications, and it's really easy to kind of like go through your mail, whatever. I try to take each approval that comes in and really savor it. Like, this is something, this person has been waiting so long for a green card and they got it. And we had something to do with that. So again, I think it can be really easy to just be hard on yourself, but if there is a win, take it, savor it. Another thing is if the client thanks you, accept that thanks and internalize it. It can be really easy to can be like, no, I didn't really do anything. It was all you, which I absolutely encourage you to go to, support the clients and let them know that it was really their hard work also that made this possible. But really taking in that thanks instead of maybe your instinct might be to push it away. So I can share this PowerPoint. These are just a bunch of different resources on vicarious trauma. And yeah, these are some of the, like I mentioned, the Wright Institute, and also Dr. Madeline Baranowski, who is a professor, again, that I met through law school, and their mental health trainings have informed this presentation. So let's see. It looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm just gonna take a look at what we have here. Are there any additional tips you have for helping to check in with and support clients during virtual or even telephone appointments? It's a very good question. I think one thing that can help is giving the client the option of whether they'd rather do video or telephone, because people have different preferences. And again, that's the way that you can give them some agency. I also learned in a training that it can be, you don't want to, if you are doing Zoom, you want to position your camera so that you're not like looking down on the client, because that can be re-traumatizing for certain clients. I think one thing is, because you're not there, you need to really check in with the client to make sure that they're in a safe and private space. A lot of clients end up maybe in their car or in the bathroom, and that's the safest, most private space for them. But it's definitely something you want to check in about at the beginning to make sure that they're, not with someone else. I think of other tips for supporting clients. I mean, sometimes I feel like, again, transparency, like, I'm so sorry, I can't see your face. I wish I could. So I wanted to check in with you about how you're doing. I think just continuing to do more check-ins than you would be maybe if you're in person and you can read the body language. Does anyone have other questions that have come up or things that you wanted to add? I know that there are a lot of people that are very experienced with trauma-informed care here.
I have a question.
Thank you. Oh, there we go.
Sorry, I just thought of this. I'm thinking of my client in particular, so this may not apply for everyone, and I won't be sharing details about them that are private, of course, but just like some, it's hard to know exactly how to summarize this, but like I want to be able to build trust with my client. My client has been traumatized by like older men before, and I'm an older man. And so just like, do you have any recommendations without like over disclosing about my personal life? Like I want to keep like a healthy boundary, like I'm serving a person's attorney, but I also want to do what I can to share like enough just like about me that like maybe they'll find some commonality and will develop some trust with me. So do you have any tips on just how to kind of like walk that line between, you know, like sharing about yourself, which is not really the point of being together with a client, but also establishing trust with them?
Yeah, that's a really hard and good question. It's something that I've thought about myself. I mean, I think maybe in yours, and again, I don't have the answers here. I think this is a really good question. I just want to kind of help think it through. But I think it could help in your situation to maybe bring it to the client, like maybe acknowledge, hey, this is I know you're talking about this, and this is part of my identity. How do you feel about that? And maybe kind of take the client's cue from there if it makes sense to share a bit more, or I guess, or really get a chance to see how they feel. And obviously they could feel, you know, if it is bothering them, it might be something that can be hard for them to bring up, but at least giving them the option to talk about it. But I think it's a really hard line of how much do you share about yourself. I tend to err more on the side of sharing less, but I don't know if that's necessarily the best thing. Like you said, you don't want to make it about yourself. I've kind of taken it like time by time. Like I work with a lot of LGBT clients, and I'm part of that community too. I usually don't bring it up, but there have been a couple times where someone felt like very, very reticent to share. And so in those cases, I did disclose because I thought it might make it easier for them to share with me and to feel, you know, supported and accepted. But it's really kind of like, it's really a judgment call. And I wish that I had an answer, but it's really something that to kind of think about on a case-by-case basis. Do other people have ideas about that, have thoughts?
Yeah, just brainstorming. But I think one thing that you could see it feels comfortable for you, Kevin, is to make some value statements. You know, maybe in your first appointment of like, I'm really honored to be partnering with you in this case. You know, I'm doing this work because I, you know, believe X, Y, and Z about the world. I believe like that you have a right to be safe. You have a right to good representation and a non-traumatic, you know, non-re-traumatizing experience. Like just some value statements that are brief could maybe help in one of your first sessions. Maybe sharing a little bit about the type of work you've done in the past too, if that feels appropriate, could be something that also makes the client feel more comfortable with you.
They're great ideas, Becca.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. That actually gives me a lot to think about and work with, and just really appreciate that advice. Also, welcome to anyone else who has thoughts too.
Any other questions? Especially if there's something that comes to mind after you've read, you know, having read your intakes and your case assignments at this point.
Abigail, oh, sorry. I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it, but I know it's important, obviously, at the beginning of the appointment to sort of set expectations about what might be asked. I missed if you said we should let them know in advance that we might be asking them questions about their experience while we're setting up that appointment, or is it okay to start that at the beginning of the appointment? And again, sorry if I missed that part.
Oh, that's a good question. So let's see. So the cases you have will have already done an intake. So I think that they'll have a sense that this is part of it. So I think that that's I'm actually a bit torn on that. Yeah, I think it makes sense to mention it. I would say that I usually don't when I'm actually scheduling the appointment. I say that we're gonna to work on your case and then talk more about it when they're in person. I think I worry about that avoidance piece of maybe the client won't come in if I mention that from the beginning. But I guess it depends on the client. And I think it would be different if they had not been in person before, because a lot of clients show up and have no idea what's happening and are just kind of like, kind of thrown off guard by what we're asking. I guess I would also ask questions if they have any questions about the appointment. And that way that they bring it up, then you can definitely share.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, well, we have reached the time that we have asked Abigail to set aside for us. So thank you so much, Abigail, for coming back to do this training, even after transitioning off the EBSC team. We feel really fortunate that you made time to do this again with us, and I found it a really helpful refresher myself. So thank you, and I'll once we get the PowerPoint, I'll share that with the crew, so they'll have that from you. And then for everyone else, we will take a 10-minute break, and then we'll start the second half of our training today. Okay.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's really great to meet you. Seems like your clients are really lucky, so I wish you all the best.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll get started at 2:27, so in 10 minutes.